Hey there, I'm Jennifer Maloney from Santa Ana College, and today we're going to be talking about heat and cold exposure. Probably sure many of you have had some experience or at least have heard of things like cold plunges or ice baths or using a sauna. And so what we want to do today is talk about what are those methods, what are the benefits, why might you want to use either heat or cold exposure, and what are some of the best practices. So first of all, cold exposure and sauna do have benefit for firefighters. If you think about the top kind of 3 causes of death in firefighters, we're looking at cardiovascular disease, suicide, cancer, and certainly cold and heat exposure do have benefits in all of those areas. They will benefit your cardiac health, your metabolic health, your mental health, and could possibly even serve as a decontamination tool. We'll talk about some of that research that's pointing to that. So first of all, we'll talk about deliberate cold exposure. Think about the mechanism for this. What we're trying to do is actually expose cold receptors on our skin to cold air, cold water, and that way we activate this chain reaction within our nervous system. So you can do this in several ways. You can have full immersion, cold water immersion. You could have partial immersion. I read a study where they had participants just put their hands in pretty icy cold water for about 4 minutes. And even that elicited some very significant benefits that we'll talk about today. You can do a cold shower. You can even be exposed to cold air on your skin. So there really does appear to be a dose response, so that the more intense the cold, and maybe if it's for a few minutes longer, you may tend to have a more robust response physiologically. But the idea is that it doesn't have to be ice cold to be effective. Really, even cold water at 50 to 60 degrees can be effective to elicit this cold shock. And you only need to really do it for 1 or 2 minutes at a time. You can build up to 5 to 10 minutes, but unless you want to be a cold water swimmer, you really don't need to go much longer than 5 or 10 minutes to have the benefits that we'll be talking about. Always, safety is going to be number 1. So if you are going to be in open water, make sure you have a partner. You always want to be aware of hypothermia, especially in young children. And you can begin with just taking a cold shower and then progress to different types of cold exposure from there. So let's explore what some of those responses are and benefits of cold exposure. First of all, when you are exposed to cold, if you've ever done that before, even just jumping in an icy or a cold pool or a cold lake or in the ocean, Pacific Ocean that's nice and chilly, you get that inspirational gasp. And that's actually an indicator that it's probably cold enough, right? So if you get some goosebumps, if it kind of takes your breath away a little bit, it typically means it's going to be cold enough to elicit this response. And what's going to happen is it will induce the sympathetic nervous system response, and you're going to release neurotransmitters and catecholamines that include things like dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and that will have an impact on your mood, on your alertness, and affect even your metabolism. So overall, cold exposure can have a significant benefit to your health. What is this cold shock? Well, we do want it to be a shock. We want it to be something that stimulates what's called your brown fat and stimulates this thermoregulatory response. So unless, like I mentioned a minute ago, unless you want to be a cold water swimmer, you actually don't want to habituate. You don't want to get used to, or the idea is not to get used to being in the cold for a really long time. That obviously can lead to problems with hypothermia, but then what happens is your body actually acclimates to the cold, and so now you need more of it to get the same response. So really a few minutes is adequate to get this response. So again, you want to keep the stimulus to stimulus and not necessarily habituate. So cold exposure can elevate your mood, it can help reduce stress, increase alertness, motivation, and energy. It does help with perception of recovery and reducing edema, inflammation, and muscular pain and soreness, and there is an improvement to our metabolic health as well. So first of all, this mood and affect, which are our emotions, our feelings, cold exposure will release neurotransmitters and catecholamines. The catecholamines are categorized as dopamine, epinephrine or adrenaline, and norepinephrine or noradrenaline. So norepinephrine is just epinephrine that's released in the brain, and epinephrine and dopamine all can increase our sympathetic response, increase our feelings of pleasure and reward. Endorphins help to reduce stress, improve our mood, and reduce pain sensations. Serotonin is our happiness hormone. So that can also elevate our mood. And so this response is nearly immediate. If you've ever experienced cold exposure, you know what I'm talking about. You get in the cold and it's not super fun, right, because it's cold. But man, you get this overwhelming rush, really, of these hormones that affect your mood so significantly. So this can really actually be a very effective way to help improve symptoms of depression and anxiety, as well as increase your alertness and your energy. So a really interesting study that was done took a group of people. They gave them the survey. It's a validated survey. It's called the Positive and Negative Affect Schedule. There's these 20 types of affects, either positive or negative. So they had these subjects take the survey. They did a brief cold exposure. I believe it was 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes of cold exposure. And then they had them take the survey again. And these were the results. So take a look at this graph. The purple is pre-cold exposure, and the green bars are post-cold exposure. 4 asterisks indicate a decisive response, meaning it was really outstanding evidence that there was a significant change, either from pre to post or either in the positive or negative direction. So if you look at this, if you look at the items that they felt significantly prior to compared to afterwards in the purple, you see things like they felt jittery, they were irritable, they felt maybe a little more hostile or guilty or upset or distressed. Okay, so those were items that they felt prior to the cold exposure relative to after. And then after, in the green bars, look at the huge benefit, right, to the positive affect. They felt more active, more attentive, more determined, inspired, alert, proud, enthusiastic, strong, excited, even a little bit more interested. So it's amazing to think that just a little bit of cold exposure can have this significant of an effect on our mood and our alertness. And I don't know anyone that can't benefit from this on any given day. So consider, again, it doesn't have to be an ice bath, full immersion. It could literally be a cold shower. It could be jumping in the ocean or a cold pool at home. And so start where you can, what's accessible to you, what's convenient, because if it's not accessible and convenient, you're likely not going to practice it on a regular basis. Okay, so you can build up to ice baths and full immersion, cold plunges, if you choose to and you have the ability to. But we thought that this is really significant evidence of the benefits to our mood and our levels of anxiety and stress with cold exposure. So one other thing that's super significant with cold exposure is what it does to our metabolism. Our bodies like to exhibit homeostasis, right? And part of that is our thermoregulatory processes we have in our body. So when we get cold, our body senses we're cold, it's going to try to make us warm. That helps to thermoregulate us. And so our brown fat is actually a type of fat that's very vital and is the key player in our thermoregulation. So brown fat is very different than our white fat. Our white fat is where we store our energy, right, in the form of fat cells and fat molecules. But brown fat is very metabolically active fat. It is packed with mitochondria, which create ATP, which takes energy, and that process of activating the brown fat activates the mitochondria, and it actually increases our core body temperature. So the very fact of exposing your skin and exposing the cold receptors on your skin to the cold will immediately activate your brown fat, which will increase your metabolism. This is important because we're born with a certain amount of brown fat, and we tend to lose it as we get older. And so you can think of cold exposure as actually like a stimulus, just like exercise is, right? You want to kind of exercise that thermoregulatory process by stimulating that brown fat in small doses a few times a week. It doesn't have to be, and it really shouldn't be, very long exposures. Again, like I said earlier, the goal isn't to stay in the cold for as long as you can. but just to get that little bit of a shock, stimulate that brown fat activation, keep it active, maintain it, and that will help to obviously increase our metabolism, which is good for long-term weight management, of course, but even more important to our health are things like insulin sensitivity. It helps to improve our insulin sensitivity and may even help to prevent diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and certainly type 2 diabetes. This picture on the left there is a picture of our brown fat cells. So that is an important component of cold exposure. Another benefit, at least in the perception, but I know for me anecdotally, I feel this, is recovery. If you've just had a hard workout, maybe you just went running, had a long cardio workout, feels great to jump in a cold pool or jump in the ocean and cool off. And that cold will vasoconstrict, right? The vessels in our lower extremities, which helps to decrease blood flow to those extremities and help to kind of feed blood and fluid back up towards our core. So cold exposure does help to improve muscular pain and soreness. It can also help to reduce inflammation and edema in the extremities after a hard workout. Now there is one situation though that's really important to note when cold exposure is actually contraindicated post-exercise. And this is if your goal is hypertrophy. And so think about strength training, heavy strength training, or hypertrophy training. You're trying to increase blood flow to the muscles, right? You're trying to get amino acids and you're trying to get nutrients to the muscles, increase blood flow, reduce waste products, and really you want to maintain that for quite a while after exercise to help induce protein synthesis. Cold exposure will work against that. So the one time you don't want to do cold exposure is anywhere from about 4 to 6 hours post-exercise where strength or hypertrophy are the training adaptations that you're working towards. Okay, so if it's been cardio exercise, you're probably going to be fine doing cold exposure after. You could certainly do cold exposure before, kind of actually stimulate you, wake you up a little bit, get your sympathetic nervous system going, make you more alert. That actually is good before exercise, but after exercise that's cardio-based is probably fine. But again, avoid cold exposure 5 to 6 hours after heavy strength or hypertrophy training. If you would like to do cold exposure prior to a heavy strength or hypertrophy workout, just keep it to really short, not super intense cold exposure, just so that you don't negatively affect that protein synthesis for the next few hours. So now, given what we've talked about, the mechanism of cold exposure, how you're stimulating cold receptors on your skin, you're activating this neurotransmitter catecholamine release, all these hormones, the central nervous system or sympathetic nervous system is kind of picking up a little bit, you're activating your brown fat. How you expose yourself to cold, there are many methods to do that. So now I want you to just think about the different methods that maybe you've seen out there, different cryotherapies where you're going into air that's extremely cooled by liquid nitrogen, or doing cryo wands, or going to those cryo spas. They're not a bad option, but they're not necessary to get the benefit. So I know I've been to one of those cryo places before. A friend of mine was working there, and I saw it as more of a spa experience. I enjoyed the whole experience of it. It wasn't necessary. I don't have to do that. That's probably something that isn't very convenient for me or very cost effective for me personally, but it's not a bad option if you like that whole experience. But I want you just to hopefully understand now you can literally use a cold garden hose, you can jump in a pool that's not heated, you can take a cold shower, you can put some ice in a bathtub from your freezer. It doesn't have to be expensive, it doesn't have to be very time consuming, but there are lots of options. So as long as you know why you're doing the cold exposure, and same with heat, you always want to know why you're doing it. And if you understand the mechanism, then you can figure out, okay, what's the best way for me to get that cold exposure for whether it's a couple minutes or 5 or 10 minutes. And then hopefully I think you have enough of the information to make the best choice for you. So just in conclusion, cold exposure, especially for first responder, is very beneficial. And please do use it to improve your mood and your affect, to reduce stress and increase motivation, and alertness to combat symptoms of anxiety and depression, relieve pain and edema, especially in your extremities, and to improve your metabolic health and your insulin sensitivity. Again, a reminder, the one contraindication is to not use cold exposure post heavy strength or hypertrophy training. Wait at least 5 to 6 hours after hypertrophy training. And then what I will add to that is, because it is such a stimulant, you probably don't want to do it too close to bedtime either. So it may just be, hey, we'll do a brief cold exposure maybe in the morning. I'm going to do my workout. If it's a heavy strength workout, I'm going to just wait till the next day to do my cold plunge. So with that, that wraps up the cold exposure part. We're going to move next into heat exposure and the use of sauna.
Hello, my name is Casey Kranz, and I'm going to be discussing sauna and heat exposure and how it relates to firefighters. We'll be discussing the benefits and best practices. So regular use of sauna has tremendous health benefits with physical health, mental health, and longevity. We're going to look at how sauna specifically improves cardiovascular health, metabolic health, brain health, and how it can potentially be used as a detoxification tool for firefighters. There are different types of saunas on the market. Traditional saunas range in temperature anywhere from 150 to 212 degrees. Steam showers, steam rooms use heat to steam to get the room hot, and those can range anywhere from 110 to 120 degrees. Infrared saunas use light to heat the body from the inside, and those range anywhere from 110 to 130 degrees. There's a general recommendation of 10 to 30 minutes per session, but you want to begin gradually and work up to more time as your body becomes more resilient to the heat. General recommendation for health benefits can be 2 to 3 times per week, upwards to 4 to 7 times per week. The skin and the core will increase in temperature. Skin can get as hot as 104 degrees, and core temperature as hot as 102 degrees. Sauna and heat exposure are both exercise mimetics, so it triggers some of the same mechanisms in the body as if it were engaged in physical activity. So we're going to see an increase in heart rate similar to that of light to moderately intense exercise, an increase in blood flow, and also an increase in vasodilation of the blood vessels. You want to make sure that you drink plenty of fluids around heat exposure. It's recommended that you drink 16 ounces of water for every 10 minutes spent in the sauna or heat. It should be noted for men that sauna and heat exposure, either through sauna use or hot tub or hot baths, can reduce sperm count for up to 45 to 60 days. So keep that in mind if that's something you're concerned with. There are alternatives to traditional saunas and different ways to get hot to activate heat shock proteins, and that is the goal of heat therapy, is to activate heat shock proteins. Up on the top right side of the screen, you see the Therasage sauna. That is a portable sauna that can be broken down and is fairly compact and is small in size and offers the benefits of a heat element as well as infrared sauna panels on the front part of the inside of the tent. So another option compared to your traditional sauna. Another way of getting hot is exercise, getting warm through movement, as well as layering up, putting on layers of clothes to become more, to increase body temperature. Hot water immersion, either in a bathtub or a hot tub, is also an option. Temperatures typically don't get as hot as a sauna, so you would want to spend more time in the hot tub or the hot bath. There's also the option, of course, of a hot room, for example, heating up your room at home or doing exercise or yoga in a hot room as well is an alternative. Heat shock proteins are activated in sauna use or heat exposure, and that is the goal, to generate the healthy benefits from heat exposure. So heat shock proteins are upregulated when the body is under stress, and they act as molecular chaperones, which help to repair damaged proteins and correct misfolding proteins. Damaged and misfolding proteins can increase our risk of neurodegenerative and neuromuscular diseases such as Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and dementia. Heat shock proteins are beneficial when activated for short periods of time. When they're activated for long periods of time, there's a point of diminishing returns, and they can actually be counterproductive for your health. This is a nice summary of how heat stress can lead to short-term, long-term, and lifelong reductions in cardiovascular risk. With acute heat stress, we see an elevation in core body temperature and an elevation or activation in heat shock proteins. We also see an increase in peripheral vasodilation and an increase in cardiac output. There's a decrease in vascular resistance and a decrease in blood pressure both during and post-heat exposure. With just 2 to 3 weeks of heat therapy, we'll see an increase in endothelial function, an increase in cardiac function, and an increase in exercise tolerance. With 8 to 12 weeks of heat therapy, we see an overall reduction in oxidative stress and inflammation, as well as apoptosis or cell death. We also see a decrease in arterial stiffness, an increase in angiogenesis or the formation of new blood vessels and perfusion, and a decrease in blood pressure and decrease in sympathetic activity. Lifelong benefits of heat exposure include an overall reduction in morbidity and mortality. So pretty powerful effect on cardiovascular risk. Continuing with that theme of improving your cardiovascular health, we know that regular sauna use improves arterial flexibility with the help of nitric oxide, which helps to vasodilate our blood vessels, and also helps in the formation of new blood vessels or angiogenesis, which helps with perfusion. The health benefits are dose dependent, so we can see that with just 2 to 3 sessions per week, there's a 30% reduction in cardiovascular mortality rates and a 25% reduction in hypertension. But with 4 to 7 sessions per week, there's a 50% reduction in cardiovascular mortality rates and a 45% reduction in hypertension. Sauna use can also be used to improve our metabolic health. Like I said at the beginning, sauna use is exercise mimetic. It triggers some of the same mechanisms as if you were engaged in cardiovascular exercise, so that's going to be beneficial for your metabolic health as well. It helps to mobilize glucose by improving insulin sensitivity and can actually break down triglycerides and cholesterol. Has a similar effect as the prescription drug metformin. And for the benefits of improving metabolic health, the standard protocol is roughly 4 to 7 sessions per week for 20 to 30 minutes to see an improvement in insulin sensitivity and lipolysis. Sauna and the brain. Research is showing that sauna use can be neuroprotective for the brain and offers many benefits for brain health as well as improving mood. Sauna can decrease cortisol levels, which helps to improve our stress response. We know that firefighters typically have elevated stress hormones throughout their shifts and possibly the day after, so this can be beneficial for firefighters in their occupation. And it can also improve mood and the capacity to feel good. Sauna offers an increase in endorphins once exposed to heat, so improvement in mood and the capacity to feel good, as well as help to reduce symptoms of depression. And there's a lot of research being done in this area currently. There's also an increase in the activation of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, which helps increase neurogenesis and bulking up the brain and can also help with learning. Studies have also shown that moderate to high use of sauna has been shown to lower the risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. There was a study in 2020 that looked at 14,000 Finnish men and women that use the sauna 9 to 12 times a month, so about 3 to 4 times per week. And the outcome of that study showed that the sauna use 9 to 12 times a month reduced their risk of dementia by over 50% over a 20-year span. So pretty powerful data there. We know that cancer is the #1 line of duty cause of death for firefighters. So there's a lot of research being done on ways and interventions to reduce the risk of exposure for firefighters. This was a study done with Tucson Fire Department and Scottsdale Fire Department, where they implemented interventions to reduce firefighter exposure. Tucson Fire Department participated in the fireground interventions, which included use of SCBA by engineers or engineers on air, also a 2-minute entry team washdown once they exited the live fire training, and contaminated equipment isolation to maintain that clean cab effect, and also showering within the hour of getting back to the fire station, as well as washing of gear upon return to the station, so the use of extractors and then scrubbing boots and masks to get rid of the soot and products of combustion on their gear. Scottsdale Fire Department followed those same fire interventions, as well as participated in a sauna session for 20 minutes at 120 degrees. So although this study had limitations, there was powerful evidence showing that the fireground interventions reduced polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in engineers and firefighters, just with the fireground interventions. However, the group that participated in the sauna use, while the reduction was measurable, it was not considered scientifically significant. So considering the limitations of this study, we know that more research is needed and more fire departments are looking to implement saunas in their stations, not just for decontamination, but for the benefits of cardiovascular disease and metabolic health. So we're looking forward to more research here, but if you think about the toxic load and exposure of firefighters, certainly sauna use done correctly can be one way to help detoxify after exposure to products of combustion. In conclusion, sauna and firefighters, just like with an exercise program, you want to start slow, start with 2 sessions per week and gradually build up to more sessions, whether your goal is 2 to 3 times per week or 4 to 7 times per week, remembering that the health benefits are dose dependent. And start with less time, 5-minute sessions, and then gradually add 5 minutes per week until you reach the target of 15 to 30 minutes per week. If using sauna after exposure to products of combustion, it's generally recommended that you do a 20-minute session. Make sure that you shower before getting into the sauna. The heat will open up your pores and we don't want to absorb those products of combustion, so shower before and after the sauna exposure. And repeat that for 2 to 7 times per week if you have that option available. Again, most departments don't have saunas on site, so you would be doing this off-duty. Looking at the research of Dr. Susanna Soberg, who is one of the top leading experts in the study of heat and cold exposure, her and her team have recommended a protocol for the minimal effective dose to gain the most benefits for metabolism and overall health. Her and her team recommend 11 minutes total per week for deliberate cold exposure, split up into 2 to 3 sessions, and 57 minutes per week, give or take, for deliberate heat exposure, again, split up into 2 to 3 sessions. There is a benefit she has found for contrast therapy, where you're moving in and out of cold and hot exposure. But again, not aiming for the most amount of time, but the least amount of time to keep the stimulus a stimulus. The protocol for contrast therapy would look like the protocol up on the screen here: 1 to 2 minutes of cold exposure, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of sauna, followed by 1 to 2 minutes of cold, 10 to 15 minutes of sauna, and ending on cold with 1 to 2 minutes of cold exposure. She recommends that for most everyone, the goal should not to become so cold or heat adapted to be able to stay in the cold plunge or sauna for the longest amount of time. The goal is to improve the health metrics that come from repeated exposure to the stimulus. So again, like Jen said, keeping the stimulus a stimulus. In practice, this means breaking deliberate exposure up into more sessions that are shorter in length. Longer sessions are not necessary and can actually be counterproductive. Dr. Soberg has also coined the Soberg principle, which is basically just to end on cold. When you end on cold, you force your body to heat up by itself. This requires your brown fat and muscles to stay activated even after being removed from that exposure, keeping the neurotransmitters active, and it makes your brown fat and muscles more efficient, delivering ongoing benefit, kind of like a high-intensity workout where you get that EPOC effect and that afterburn. The same is true of ending on cold. And that concludes our cold heat lecture. Thank you so much for your time. We hope that you have learned different ways and benefits of cold to heat exposure, how to realistically include them in your day-to-day health practices to help improve cardiovascular health, metabolic health, brain health, and detoxification practices.